Okay, so now we're going to get into the theory behind our topic, starting with the first of our 3 points, the Solow growth model. Growth has limits. Now, keep in mind, this is an extremely simplified version for first-time survey students. The real deal is called a neoclassical growth model. It has what we call micro foundations in that everything that we talk about, the wage of labor, the rental rate of capital, the percent that you invest, all of that are outcomes of individual markets that have their own individual market equilibriums. You, of course, won't have to do that. I'm showing you the very basic version of it where it all boils down to one graph and just a little bit of logic. Okay, so Robert Solow's argument. Let's start with production. Production requires 2 things, capital and labor. Marx calls it means of production and labor. We have to have workers and we have to have tools. If we're talking agriculture, we also have to have land, which they can work with. And what we care about generally is per capita production. How much production are we getting per person? Now, this itself is actually something you could argue about. You might say that, a bigger country has more people in it, and so it's inherently better because even if the individual people are poorer, there's more people overall, so there's more happiness from folks getting to live their lives. Usually in economics, we are assuming that we care about the quality of life more than the total amount of life. So we're going to judge the merits of a country based on its GDP per capita, GDP per person. Now, think way back to the supply topic. I know that's a big ask because it was so long ago, but think all the way back to then. I pitched this idea to you as part of the justification for the law of supply, that there is what's called diminishing returns in production. There's this notion that the factors of production, the things that we use to make output, all have their own proper proportions. There is a certain ideal amount of capital per worker. There's a certain ideal amount of land per worker, an ideal size of a building to contain the capital, and so on and so forth. Productivity will be maximized if everything is in the proper proportion, if everything has the ideal right amount. And if you were to go higher in one category, then you would still raise output. If you hire more workers, they're not going to lower your production. If you buy more machines, they're not going to lower your production. Worst case scenario, you have all those extra workers and extra machines just sit around outside doing nothing. You shoo them out of the workplace so that they don't get in anyone's way. That's your worst case scenario. More resources cannot make you poorer. But the problem is more resources are not going to be more efficient. You have a worker, you have the right amount of machines for him. You buy him more tools, you buy him more machines, you buy better tools or better machines. It makes him more productive. But it doesn't make him as productive as the first machine did. If you give him more sets of tools, he spends less time searching for his tools. You buy a better even faster, machine to work at, it does the job even quicker. But a bit of mechanization goes a long ways, and it's always going to go further than the next step. The more you have of something, the less useful it is, as a rule, at the margin. On the graph down here, this concept is going to be implied by this green curve, output per worker. On the horizontal axis, we have capital per worker. On the vertical axis, we have output per worker. Output and capital are both being measured in dollars. You can think of it like we do with inflation and with GDP. With those, I told you, imagine it as being like a shopping cart, a representative bundle of all the things that a consumer would buy. Well, here it's a representative bundle or shopping cart of all of the different inputs to making a good. Oh, here's some welding equipment for the welders. Oh, here's a tractor. Here's a fax machine for an office. Just if we were going to spend another dollar to invest in the economy, this is what we would buy. So we're measuring it in terms of the expenditure, and we're measuring the output likewise in terms of the monetary value of what's being produced, adjusted for inflation. These growth models aren't going to have any place for inflation, right? Solow's growth model isn't worried about the money supply. Now notice how, as you increase the capital per worker, output always goes up. It never goes down, but it goes up by less and less and less. The more well-equipped the workforce is, the less they're going to benefit from an increase in how well-equipped they are. Now, furthermore, Solow argues capital depreciates and it must itself be produced. What is depreciation? Well, you are probably familiar with depreciation as an accounting concept. You buy a new car and 30% of its value depreciates immediately. Things lose value the more they're used. In economics, we tend to use depreciation to refer to some kind of physical damage, physical spoilage. I own a machine, and that machine breaks. I own a car, and something goes wrong in the engine. I own a computer, and rats decide to nest inside of it and chew up the wires. I own a house, and the house gets foundation damage, and the walls crumble, and it collapses. All physical objects are subject to depreciation. Things wear out, things crumble, things rust, things get eaten up by insects and bugs and rats and moths. Your stock of clothing will depreciate in that it'll get holes in it. And eventually you have to either pitch it out or you repair it, and the repairing costs you something. Now, Solow's big focus, really the whole focus, the whole crux of his model revolves around this idea. We can save money to buy capital, but we also have to replace capital we already owned because that capital wears out. Now, he's going to claim that capital depreciates linearly. This is something you could argue about. You might say that if the worker has more machinery, then, They're probably not using each machine as intensely as before, but machinery is measured in dollar value, not any like quantity. So it could also be that they're using a more expensive machine, and that more expensive machine breaks down just as fast as the old one does. Either way, for the sake of his argument, we're going to take for granted that depreciation is linear. And so now we're going to add two more lines onto the graph. So firstly, we assume that a certain amount, a certain percentage of the output is going to be invested. How much of our output is dedicated not to producing C or G, consumption or government spending, but towards producing I, towards producing new capital? And that's going to be this red line. And the red line could be anything from 0%, right? It could be perfectly flat. We don't save a single thing. Or it could be 100%. Maybe we're dedicating our entire economy just to making machines. Would sound a little goofy, but that's not far off from what the Soviet Union did to industrialize. They would literally take grain away from farmers in Ukraine, sell the grain and buy machines, and let the farmers starve to death. Big focus on, investment at all costs. Build the capital stock as fast as humanly possible. Now, the other line, the straight line, that is our depreciation. It calls it break-even investment on the graph, but just call that depreciation. For a given amount of capital, a certain percentage of it spoils. So that goes up in a straight line. And you'll notice we have one line that's going up straight. It goes up at a fixed rate, a fixed slope. And then we have another line that starts out steep, but it's constantly going up slower and slower. Its slope decreases over time. And so this means that the two are going to have to cross at some point, and they're going to cross at one and only one point. If the higher curve is leveling off and they're both going upwards, the lower curve has to cross the higher curve. And what would it mean for them to cross? Well, that would be saying at this level of capital, the amount of new capital you're buying is equal to the amount of capital that's breaking down, the amount that's depreciating, which would imply that all of your investment is going towards replacing stuff that is broken. And we'll have a special name for this point. In growth, we tend to call this a steady state, but you can also think of it as an equilibrium, because this is basically going to be the equilibrium concept for growth economics. It's kind of unfortunate that they even use another name for it, because they are the same thing. It's the same idea. It's steady, it's stable, because once your capital gets to that level, it's not going to change on its own anymore. See, imagine if we started out below. If we started out below, then at lower capital levels, your investment, the amount of new capital you buy, is higher than the amount that's depreciating. And so that entire gap is going to be gain for you. You're buying more than you're replacing, so the capital stock is increasing, and so your output per worker is also increasing. But as the capital stock increases, the rate at which you have to replace it stays the same, but the extra output and therefore extra investment is starting to decline. You have more resources, but you don't have proportionally more resources. The gap between the two is narrowing. So the more capital you have, you're still going to keep growing your capital stock, but the amount by which it grows narrows and narrows and narrows until they're equal and it can't go up anymore. Likewise, if you were to start out above the steady state, well, you would see that the depreciation would be higher than the investment. More machines are breaking than you are buying. And so your capital stock is falling. If your capital stock is falling, your output per worker is falling. And you're eventually going to fall all the way back down to the steady state. No matter where you start along this horizontal axis, you're always going to be drawn in to the steady state. Just like with the market equilibrium. That a market, supply and demand, always wants to get back to the same price and quantity unless something causes a shock. And there is an intuition to this idea too. Now let's imagine a worst case scenario. Let's imagine some goofiness where your society decides to go 100% in on investment. Literally everything you produce, every moment of your productive time is used making more machines so that you can make more machines later down the line. Now, it could be tempting to say, oh, well, output would have to keep going up because we're always making more machines. But these machines still break, and they may not break as fast. That would imply that the blue curve is not straight, that it too diminishes. But even if you are making machines and just putting them in storage, they're still subject to the elements. You might have them in that warehouse, but that warehouse gets vines. That warehouse's foundations get washed out. Cracks form in the walls. If you leave a building alone long enough, that building will fall on its own. At least a lot of modern ones that aren't built to be as durable. If things aren't sheltered properly, well, they'll get damaged from water. They'll get damaged from rust. Pests and bugs will get in and eat away at the wiring. Natural disasters like fires will break out. Even things like roads wear down. They get potholes, they get cracks. Given enough time, they turn essentially into gravel. Given enough time, they turn into dirt. Given enough time, they'll turn into wild forest like they once were. You could imagine a world where the city of Clemson decides that in order to grow the economy, it's going to build an extra bridge to Seneca. We already have 2 bridges to Seneca right next to each other, but sometimes there might be a little bit of extra traffic on one, and if we build a 3rd bridge to Seneca, it could cut down on travel time a little. That would make it cheaper, even if only by like a penny, to bring stuff between the 2 towns. It would grow output. But you'd have to maintain that 3rd bridge. Now imagine if you had, say, 12 bridges to Seneca. Well, those bridges are not going to hurt the economy. You would expect that bridge, it might only add a penny's worth of GDP in a whole year, but it'll add it. But that bridge is still sitting out there getting hammered by the forces of wind, water, and the sun. And given enough time, it's going to fall back into the river unless you replace it. Well, if you had too many bridges, you wouldn't expect that bridge to have paid for itself over its lifetime, right? This is the idea behind the steady state. An economy naturally grows through capital accumulation. There's different ways economies can grow, but one of them is capital accumulation, and this is the kind that Karl Marx focused on. If I had thought of it, I would have included it in the Marxism lecture. But to him, growth comes from capitalists saving part of the profits they earn through exploitation and plying it back into buying even more capital. That's what makes them capitalists. And thus the economy gets bigger. But an economy can't get bigger forever in this way, because the capital has to at least be able to support itself. And you can have a situation where you live in such abundance in terms of your abilities that you can't keep up with it all. You can't maintain it. A world that's so overextended that it has to spend all of its efforts just restoring and repairing what's breaking. You're always rushing from disaster to disaster. Now, there's several big implications we get out of this. The first one, like I said, is that there is a limit, a steady state to how big you can get. Now, investment spending can still make sense. A lot of infrastructure falls into the categories of public goods and natural monopolies. So if a country is not already at the steady state, then it makes sense for the government to invest in those things. And then there's also the private capital, which too has the potential to grow. Now, we may or may not be at the steady state. In the case of the business cycle, we're not at the steady state for unnatural reasons, right? The capital exists, but it's not being used. In a longer term sense, we may or may not have filled our full limits. But we know that there are limits, that there is some hypothetical maximum that we, with our existing technology, with our existing population, with our existing modes of social organization, are capable of achieving. Point number 3. I'm skipping ahead a little bit. I realize that that would make more sense to organize it that way. Mayday, mayday. 1, 2, 3. And another big implication of this is that you can't cheat. You can't just try to invest your way past the steady state, because you're going to wind up there in the end. If you somehow wind up with more capital, then your capital stock is just going to decline over time. Now, this actually comes up with in all kinds of practical and historical applications. This comes up with foreign aid. Very often, people, especially conservatives, will say that they would rather give foreign aid that's focused on raising the productivity of another economy instead of just giving them consumer goods. Teach a man to fish instead of giving a man a fish. Now, if the foreign aid you give them makes them more productive, we'll come back to this point, then that's a sensible goal. But if this involves some kind of grant of capital and it goes beyond their steady state, you won't achieve any kind of lasting change. If the country was for some reason unproductive to where it couldn't support that kind of accumulation on its own, it's not going to be able to support it when you give it machinery and tools for free. And this happens. We'll see governments invest in another poor country trying to help build it up, and they build them infrastructure that they don't have the means to maintain, or they'll build them some kind of factory facility logistical system that they don't have the means to use in the first place, and it ends up decaying before our eyes. Now, on the other hand, this also can explain certain patterns in economic growth. So, one thing, by the time you're watching this, you probably already read through the chapter on Malthus in your Worldly Philosophers book. If I had more time, I would teach Malthusianism as its own topic in this unit. We would talk about Malthusianism, and then we would talk about systems. But Malthus had this argument that, and his model looks kind of similar to Solow's model. But Malthus has this argument that mass death is actually good for the living standards of people. It's not necessarily good in and of itself because we put a value on our loved ones. But mass death is one of the few things that raises living standards because it clears out people, but it leaves behind all this excess capital and land that they're able to use. In a sense, if you have a mass death event that leaves the physical material of society intact and it only kills people, then you get knocked down, or no, that's wrong. you basically get knocked up. It's not that you have more capital now, it's just that you have less workers, so you have more capital per workers. And because of that, we often see that after things like famines and plagues, wages would increase. This happened with the Black Death. And I don't particularly agree with it myself, but some economists like to argue that the roots of the Industrial Revolution can actually be traced back to the Black Death. So many Englishmen died that it freed up so many extra resources that they could start to develop things that they couldn't afford to before that point. But without a transition to some kind of higher steady state, that too is going to go away in time. And it did in most of Europe and in Asia. Wages shoot up during the Black Death, and then they start to fall over time as people get to breeding, as people both failed to maintain their gains and also actively, spread it out among more kids. You see it with things like the decline of the Roman Empire. They have this fantastic aqueduct system, very modern looking civil engineering, able to bring in water to desert towns, able to bring clean running water to poor people's homes, a luxury that you wouldn't get until the late 1800s. Well, this stuff doesn't go away immediately. Many of the aqueducts are still standing to this day, but many of the aqueducts are also broken down today. They had officials whose job was to take care of them, to fix holes in them, to make sure that the bricks weren't, falling apart, patch it up. And when they stopped maintaining it, it started to rot. Now, if you travel around Europe, you can often come across these lone sections of, it kind of looks like looking at a bridge because it's these big, they are bridges. It's just that they're carrying water down at a grade, suspended up in the air by big pillars. It's like something you'd see in an apocalypse movie. because it is. That was a civilization that had its own apocalypse. And their output per worker could only decline because of it, because they lost the means to maintain their stock, to maintain their infrastructure. But there's also a happy conclusion that you can draw from Solow's model as well. And that's that the less capital you have, the faster you're going to grow. So the red line I said was your investment in new capital, and the blue line was your depreciation of existing capital. So the gap between the two would have to be the extra capital you're getting, right? When red's above blue, it's gains. When blue's above red, it's decline. Well, notice that over most of the range, see, if you have almost no capital to start with, you have almost nothing to invest. But if you have a regularly sized economy, notice that the gap, again, the whole idea was that the gap is getting smaller and smaller. Well, this tells us that if you have very little capital, you're able to accumulate new capital faster because your existing capital is super productive and you don't have much you have to replace. It's like an upside to being poor. You're so poor that you have almost no expenditures on keeping up your own property because you have none. And every little bit you get makes a huge difference. So the poorer a country is, as a rule, the faster it should be able to grow.